The next concept is actually related to that I want to make sure we cover, and that's the concept of legal personhood. Now you'll notice I did not put corporate personhood, but just legal personhood. And that's because this means, under law, the ability to assert rights. Quite simply, if you are a legal person, you have the ability to assert rights. Assert. And that is a very important idea. And then the last concept I want to make sure we cover is corporation. Now, in some respects, I put it up last because it might well be the least important concept here. Because I invite you to ask this question. What if the problem isn't really with corporations at all? What if the problem is really with us? What if at the end of the day, the real problem is how we're conducting ourselves, how we're thinking about ourselves, how we're engaging in society? What if that's really the problem? Of course, thank you for that, but as soon as I say it, I think, David, what are you saying? Of course the problem is with big corporations, because I'll tell you something. I agree with you that we the people are not ruling today. And you know why? Because of transnational corporations. Because let me tell you something, folks. Today, I don't believe that corporations are merely exercising power. The large transnational corporations are ruling us. They are making the fundamental public policy decisions that affect our lives. They're the ones deciding how much poison will be spewed into the water that we're all collectively drinking. Unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are choosing how much toxins will be in the air that we're all having to breathe. Corporate CEOs are making the decisions about what our transportation choices will be. Corporations are making the decisions about how much health care we'll get, or today, how much we won't get. Corporations are making the decisions about our energy policy, and corporate CEOs are basically deciding whether this country goes to war or not. Yeah. That's the degree to which we have lost control of this country. And as a quick example, let me do this pop quiz. How many people in this auditorium are eating genetically modified foods? Raise your hands. All right. Say it louder. Somebody said it. All of us. And why might that be? That's crazy. Because we don't know. Because a public decision about our public food supply was not made through a public process. Instead, who made that decision?
The FDA.
Actually, it was Monsanto, Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill Corporation, Pioneer Hybrid Corporation, and they made that initial decision behind closed doors. They claimed it was a private decision. So we, the people, did not only were we not allowed to participate in making it, we didn't even know it was being made until after the fact. And only after it was in the public food supply did the FDA get involved and then began to hold hearings after the fact. And frankly, folks, today in the United States, you know what the biggest fight around GMOs are? Labeling. Do you know what the biggest fight is in Latin America and Europe where they're fighting GMOs? Ban it. Ban it. I mean, do you see the difference?
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is I think that frequently we in the United States, engaged citizens, ought to actually be taking a lesson from our sisters and brothers in the global South, who have actually been much more willing to engage in the kind of movement building, the kind of struggle for real power. And isn't it interesting that in Latin America, in North Africa, in the Middle East, you're seeing blossoming, burgeoning democracy movements break out that are, to me, breathtaking, where so many Americans today are not able to actually even dare to imagine doing the thing that our sisters and brothers in the global South are doing. Now, the reason then that I wanted to go through this idea of the corporation is to make it clear that it is true that they're really exercising power today. So since this concept is so clearly so very important, I think that we ought to ask the same question. What language is the word corporation from? It's Latin. That's right. And so let's break it down the same way. Corpus means body. And now for extra credit, my Latin scholars, T-I-O-N, that suffix? The state of being. So basically, the word corporation, if you actually define it, means to have or give body. Now, can I ask, Are there any lawyers besides me in this crowd that would be willing to admit it? No? I saw the hand reluctantly go up, sister. I myself am a recovering lawyer, so I can understand. Let me ask you, sister, do you remember, what's your first name? Patricia. Patricia, in law school, do you remember being taught this? A corporation is a legal fiction. Does that sound familiar? Yes. Now, how many of you have heard that phrase? Oh, look, so many of you. So here's something worth asking. What does the word fiction mean?
Lie.
Lie, made up, not true, right?
Illusion.
Illusion. So the idea is, and frankly, we're taught, we are brainwashed in law school to think of it this way. A corporation doesn't really exist in the real world, but we'll pretend like it exists. We'll pretend like this amalgamation of individuals and money and contractual relationships and this very complex sort of association of people and effort and so forth, we'll pretend like it's one thing. We'll give it body and pretend like it exists. And enough people think that something is true, if enough people act like it's true, it's true. And so, presto, changeo, poof, we've just created a corporation. And the word corporation is Latin because the original corporations that we would understand and think of today as a corporation were actually first created during the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire. And sometimes I wish we had enough time to really ask ourselves, what happens when a nation-state devolves from being a republic to an empire? Because that might be an important conversation in the United States. Flag that idea. Maybe we'll come back to it. But the first corporations ever created by the genius of humans was during the Roman Republic. What does a road system, a water system, a hospital, a university, what do those have in common? They're all public goods. The genius of the idea of the corporation originally was to create a public good. But how did they do it? They took private effort, private money, private resources in order to do a public good. So the genius of the corporation, and I want to be clear, David Cobb is not anti-corporation. The Move to Amend Coalition is not anti-corporation. There is a profoundly important role for corporations to play in society. And that, I just gave you an example, a way to actually take resources, both money and energy and time, collectively operate. That is actually fantastic. And of course, this is not the first time that, or the idea of the Roman corporation wasn't the first time that private monies had been taken in order to achieve this purpose, right? Because before, there was another way that private monies would be taken. What was that called? Taxes. And when the Roman centurion shows up to collect taxes, does the centurion say, here's what we plan to do with all of your money, would you be willing to pay? No. No! The Roman centurion shows up and says, pay up. And if they try to do like Orville just did and says, no, they put the spear into the throat. Pay up! The genius of a corporation is to take private monies on a voluntary basis. This idea is actually a genius idea, to take private money on a voluntary basis and put it to some public project. I think that's a fantastic idea, and we should not lose sight of that. We should definitely keep that institution. We should definitely keep that idea. But of course, the problem is that the modern transnational corporation doesn't exactly work under that framework, does it? That's because the modern transnational corporation actually comes out of, it is birthed during the time period of the 13th, 14th, and 15th century of Europe. You know, the age of discovery. I have to put discovery in those imaginary quotation marks because I already told y'all I would tell the truth. And it's not truthful to call that the age of discovery at all. After all, what did they discover and who were they? Well, they were the Europeans, and what did they discover? Africa, Asia, later North and South America. Newsflash, there were people living there. They weren't lost. They didn't need to be discovered, right? So, in the spirit of truth-telling, let's tell the truth. That age was the age of rape and pillage and plunder and murder. That's imperialism. And that's what imperialism really means. It is the conquest of other people, then to brutally subject them, and then to steal their resources. That's what that age of discovery really was all about, imperialism. And here's the kicker. The modern transnational corporation was literally created during that time period because as an institution, it was created to facilitate the imperialism of rape and pillage and plunder and murder. And I'm not making this up. The first of the joint stock companies, or the first major corporations that we would think of today, were little outfits like the Dutch East India Corporation, right? That was literally designed to facilitate and legalize the colonial destruction of the peoples all around what we now know as the Indonesian archipelago. And of course, there was another early corporation called the Africa Trading Company. Does anybody want to hazard a guess what the Africa Trading Company traded?
Slaves.
Somebody else said something else that I'd like to not. I think the word slaves, human beings, people. Thank you, sister. People, because frankly, and I don't say this out of ugliness to anybody, but to ask us to consider our own mindset. That we would, so many of us would immediately think that they traded slaves. Well, it's not like Africa was full of slaves, right? They were filled with people, human beings. And I think that's an important distinction to make, to really catch ourselves and to realize the degree to which we sort of follow a narrative that's been told to us and really question it. Because I'll tell you this, I will tell you the Africa Trading Company traded people who were basically just like me. And so I say this as part of this overall story to ask us to come to terms with this reality. That the idea of racism and imperialism and corporatism are all inextricably linked. And I'm not the first American to say that, because another great American said it before me in what I believe is his greatest political speech. It's not his most famous political speech, because this great American I'm referring to's most famous speech is "I Have a Dream." The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech, of course, is "I Have a Dream," and he delivered that in Washington, D.C. to 100,000 people gathered together. And it's a stirring speech, and it's beautiful. However, what I believe is his best speech, his best bit of political oratory, he delivered at the Riverside Church at Harlem. He delivered that speech titled "Beyond War," or "Beyond Vietnam," where he said America has been and continues to suffer from a social, moral, and ethical decay because we have not come to terms with what he called the triple evils of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. And that, you can applaud that. That's his most famous, or should be his most famous, it's his most profound, his most astute political speech. And I submit to you, that is our problem today. We have not been willing as a people to come to terms with racism, militarism, and rampant extreme materialism. And thus we are mired in a social, moral, and ethical decay, and we've got to do something about it. And so now let's take our story and take it right to the United States and the founding of this country. How many original colonies?
13.
13. That was a gimme, Dennis. But here's the real question. Of those 13 original colonies, and by the way, they're colonies, colonialism, imperialism, that might be important. But of those 13 original colonies, how many of them were actually corporations? It was a trick question. Somebody said it right off the jump. All of them. And I say all of them because I tell you that it was up to the king to create Massachusetts, Virginia, Georgia. Now, some of you might say, Massachusetts was already there, and that's why it's a trick question. The land was already there, right? The people who lived on that land, the forests and the streams and the birds and the fish, Massachusetts was already there, but the king gave body to or created Massachusetts. How did he do that?
Charter.
With a charter. And here's the kicker. That charter that the king created, the king did not create the state of Massachusetts. Do you know what the king actually created?
Corporation.
Exactly. The king didn't even create the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The king created the Massachusetts Bay Trading Colony.